Welcome to Ignite Your Confidence for women in leadership who want to speak up and stand out. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Here you'll get all of the tips and tools that you need to stand out with unshakable confidence. Let's jump into today's episode. Today is all about how to communicate with clarity. I'll say that again. Today is all about how to communicate with clarity. And before I go into this episode, I wanted to let you know that I have a freebie on my website. And if you have not grabbed it yet, I've been getting so much good feedback on it. I wanted to make sure that you had access to it as well. It's called 9 Words to Avoid and What to Say Instead. And if you go over to my website, you will not only get that, but then you will be on my email list to get those tips every week. So let's go into how to communicate with clarity. I've got 3 things for you specifically. I always like to have 3 main points, and then I've got a lot of bullets in them, and it's very heavy on the first point. The first bullet point is audiences need structure. The second one is I'm going to give you a model for how to introduce yourself with clarity. And then the third is the power of the pause. So we'll dive into all of those today. The first thing, communicating with clarity takes intention. And we have to remember that audience is the way, and I'm talking about, it could be a big audience, it could be an audience of one, audience of many, audience of one. Audiences need structure so that they know where you're headed, what you're doing. Otherwise, they're going to get lost, tune out. And as Donald Miller says, if they have to burn too many calories to know what your point is, they are probably going to tune out and not listen to you. If it takes too much work, people aren't going to stay with us. So the way that we need to help them to focus, help them stay engaged, is to give them structure. And I'll explain what I mean by that. The first thing to think about is, what is your point? If you're going to communicate with clarity, you need to have a point and state it up front. There's a US military term called bottom line up front, BLUF, or bluff, as I like to call it. And a good example of this is to go back and look at the last 3 to 5 emails that you wrote that you wanted somebody to take action on, and ask yourself, where was the point? Was it in the beginning or was it buried at the end? Another way to think about this in journalism, they call it the lead of the story. Where is the lead of your story? Is it at the end or the top? We are always competing with people's scroll test, as I like to call it. Your email needs to pass the scroll test. And what this means is, if you think about yourself looking at your phone, trying to decide either which emails to read or what news articles to read or what social media post you want to read, it's based on the first line or the subject line or the headline in the case of a news article. So making sure that we have a pithy point so that people can be drawn to it and then know, oh, do I want to keep listening to this or not? Will the rest of these details now be interesting because now I know what the point is? Yes, a much greater chance of that happening than stating a bunch of details with no point, because people don't know how to attach those details to anything. If it's a bunch of detail randomly, it's not going to be very easy. As a matter of fact, I am in a wonderful group of women that are in business together, not together. We have different businesses, but we are together in a group. And it's really funny because we use a voice memo app called Voxer. And it's so fascinating when people just start talking and you don't know why you're listening. Don't be that person. When you start any message of any sort, whether it's a voice message, voicemail, voice memo, you're presenting to someone, you're talking to a friend, front load it with why you're going to share it or what you want from that. So for example, you could say something like, I want to process what happened, or I only need you to listen, or the point of this message is this, or what I'm looking for is a question that I'm going to get to at the end. So please bear with me in my messiness as I walk through this. And I just need to talk this out, but then I will have a question at the end. So giving us that structure helps us to be a more active listener. Keep that in mind. When you give an audience or a person, when I'm talking audience, I'm talking an audience of one or many. When you give the audience structure, you help them to be more actively listening to you.
And if you want to be listened to, that's what you need to do. We probably all know plenty of people that ramble, and that is hard to stay listening to because you're going, where are they going with this? What are they doing? So my other tip is how to stop rambling and get to the point. In the spirit of communicating with clarity, if you notice yourself rambling, stop, pause, and say out loud, my point is this. That will help you to come across as much more focused. If you don't want to say my point is this out loud, pause, gather your thoughts, and move on. State your point and move on. Why I prefer to say it out loud, and this is a trick that I taught myself. When I say it out loud, or when other people say it out loud, suddenly everybody around you goes, oh, she has a point. It suddenly refocuses the conversation, and you also probably will be more focused yourself. I have tried this many times because I am a recovering rambler myself, so I know the result and how much better it is when I say that out loud. The other thing related to audiences needing structure is to focus your content numerically. So for example, I have 3 things I want to tell you. Those of you that have listened to this podcast several times, you will notice that oftentimes I say I have 3 tips or I have 5 tips, and I usually state them all in short up front. Then I go through the details because the reason is that when I say those points up front, that hooks you hopefully to want to hear more. But if I say I have 5 things, that's still fine. I can leave the rest a mystery, but I do personally prefer to give a quick hit answer. Here are the 3, here are the 5, or whatever it is. And then I go into detail. And you'll also notice probably as you listen to my solo episodes that I am guiding you along this journey of structure. I'm telling you what I'm going to share with you, then I'm sharing it with you, then I recap it at the end. It's that old adage of tell them what you're going to tell them, tell them what you told them. All right. In the spirit of that, when you say things like there's 3 things I'm going to cover, or here are the 5 steps to blah, blah, blah. Think about Stephen Covey. Many of you know him. He wrote the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And when we have a numeric, what do you call it? Basically a number attached to a concept, it makes us all interested. And now we're keeping track. We can keep that structure in our brain, and it's a lot easier. It's the same thing when somebody says the 10 steps to greater success or whatever. Now, in the research, generally speaking, people can remember 3 things. Once you get to more than that, it's harder to remember them all. So if you really want people to remember your talk, your message, whatever, my suggestion would be that you focus on 3 or fewer. All right. Here's another story related to structure. Sometimes it's as simple as saying, what is the one thing I want to get across? This relates back to the point of your message, but sometimes it can be as simple as, here's one thing that I want to share. I can remember, actually, I'm going to give you 2 examples. I remember somebody in my life years ago who used to leave voicemails, and she would say, hey, Karen, 2 things. And then she would say the 2 things, and then that would be an amazing structure. So then I could determine if I wanted to listen more and call her back, but it was very clear what she was saying. Okay, the story I want to share with you, some of you have heard before, but this is when I was coaching somebody in interviewing. And what happened was we did the typical interview question. I did a role play and I said, tell me about yourself. Well, she definitely told me about herself, but in way too much detail. And I said, okay, time out. All of that detail is fantastic. The problem is it's not framed in a container that will help me to listen actively. It becomes a data dump, becomes monotone, and it's really hard to pay attention. And the bottom line is, I don't know, out of those 10 things, what's the most important thing you want me to know about you? So I said, you got to think about your audience. Think about what they care about. Think about why what you're saying would matter to them. And remember, as a hiring manager, they are stacking you up against several other candidates, most likely. So they need to decide as quickly as possible if you are the right fit for the job. And by the way, they are looking at your expertise and your experience along with your character and the relationship side of you. Are you likable along with your expertise? So that's another important thing to remember that sometimes we forget because we get so focused on our content. But that's a topic for a whole other podcast. So remembering the one thing can be helpful. So here's what she did. Let me tell you the after. First of all, I suggested, what is the one thing you want them to know about you that relates to the job? And she said, well, I love research. And I said, great, lead with that. So we did it again. I said, tell me about yourself. Well, this time she said, before I go into any detail, the one thing you need to know about me is this, is that I love research. Excuse me. I'm saying that more generically, but ultimately she said, the one thing you need to know about me is that I love research. And that's the most important part of this job as it was advertised. So right away, she's appealing to her audience. She's super clear about the lead of her story. It is not buried in a bunch of detail. And then here's the cool thing. She could still say all of the other detail, but it comes later. So it's perfect. It's like frosting on a cake. All of that is added detail that somebody could have listened to if they wanted to or decide not to. Really, really, really beautiful example of that. And that was a huge call up for me when I was doing that with her years ago. It was such a good example of how we need to be really clear up front. Another way that you can structure things for your audience is to use something called a flagging statement. All it is flagging something that's coming. So in your personal life, you might say something like, you're never going to believe what happened to me this weekend. And all of a sudden people go, they lean in. Tell me more. What's coming? It's a statement that flags something important to come. It could also be something like, these next 3 points are critical for you to know in your job. Suddenly everybody's listening. Or one of my favorites, and this was a real example. I remember when I was training people to be coaches at my last job, I remember trying out different things to keep them engaged during the training process. And I said something like, would you rather hear about the 5 tips of what would be effective in your role or how you could be effective in your role? Or would you rather start with the 5 mistakes most coaches in this role have made before? What do you think they chose? Everybody wants to avoid mistakes. So they wanted to know the mistakes. They said, give us the mistakes. And that was a crowd pleaser, shall we say. Okay, so that is what I have to share related to audiences needing structure. The second thing related to, well, this is all around structure, but the second way to communicate with clarity is to use my PPU method for your introduction. A lot of people will tell me that they were thrown off by the question, or they're thrown off in life by the question of, tell me about yourself. An introduction seems to be one of the hardest things to say, because a lot of people say, well, I don't know what to say. There's so much I could say. I don't know. And then a lot of people say, I don't like to talk about myself. Well, we always need to be ready to talk about ourselves, because that is the only way that you're going to communicate your value and help people see who you are in the world, as well as your expertise and your credibility and your likability and all those other wonderful things. Here's the PPU model. Say something personal, professional, and unique about you. Here's what it could sound like. Hi, I'm Karen Laus. Personally, I am from Minneapolis, but now I live in San Francisco with my husband and 2 cats named Mojo and Callie. I don't usually say the names of my cats, but anyhow, you can adjust this as you'd like. So that's the personal. So with my 2 cats, Mojo and Callie. On a professional note, I'm a keynote speaker specifically for women who want to speak up and ask for what they want. And I help them through executive presence and messaging. On a unique note, something a little bit unique about me is that I always had a dream to move to Manhattan or to live there. So I decided for the entire month of my 50th birthday that I would live there like a local. So I rented an apartment and had a great time to fulfill that dream. That's a little bit about me. Notice it's simple, it's clear, it's easy to remember. Personal, professional, unique. Now, your unique does not have to be super fancy, like you went to Manhattan for a month. That's pretty unusual. But it could be something like, something unique about me is that I love traveling to Fiji, or whatever it is. Or something unique about me is that I have a hobby of XYZ, whatever it is. But that can help you to create structure for yourself as well as your audience and stay concise. Because one of the biggest mistakes that I see with introductions is people start rambling about themselves and they're talking way too much. And this can be a huge problem. I am thinking right now about a CEO that I coached years back. He was what do you call it? He was CEO of a startup that was getting a lot of press. And so he was doing a lot of interviews. So I was helping him with his press interviews. And one of the things that I noticed is that, and he also said, I want to get better at having lunch with journalists and asking good questions and listening and all of that. So what was interesting is that throughout the entire day, I spent the whole day with him doing a VIP day. And after lunch, I decided to tell him something and give him some constructive feedback. I said, we'll call him Tom. I said, hey, Tom, I know that you're talking with journalists a lot and you're having conversations with people to talk about your product and your startup. And I have to tell you, this entire day that we have been together, you have not asked me one question about myself. Now, I don't care. Personally, I'm not offended. It doesn't bother me. But if you want to have people listen to you, you're engaging them in conversation, you have to stop talking all about yourself. You need to ask questions. You need to listen. You need to pause, allow them to respond. And he was kind of taken aback by that, but it was really good feedback for him. Lastly, the third thing is the power of the pause. Recognize when you're communicating with clarity that pausing is a beautiful skill to have. First of all, instead of a filler word, it should replace filler words. Instead of so replace silence instead. I recently interviewed somebody who is a beautiful person. I really, really like her. But I was very surprised that in a 30-minute conversation on we won't say where it was, a 30-minute conversation, she said 172 times. And it's not like I was counting, but I do want to say we have AI for that, thankfully. And we also have a wonderful system to be able to take that out of a episode with just one touch of a button. But if she had simply paused instead, that would have made all the difference. The other reason why pausing is so powerful is because it shows control. When you pause, people listen. They want to know what's coming. When you pause effectively, specifically when you pause, sometimes even for drama, sometimes to help people absorb what you just said, all of these things really help to show control. And with control comes credibility. So pausing is directly linked to credibility. The other thing that we don't talk a lot about is pausing to look at your notes. If you're giving a presentation or you're leading a meeting, pause, look down at your notes, then look back at the audience. You don't have to be looking at your notes. You don't want to be looking at your notes for a while you're talking. You want to be talking and looking at people at the same time. Use the silence to look at your notes, gather your thoughts, and then look back at the audience. That usually only takes a second or two. And if you have incorporated pauses into the rhythm of your speech, whether it's a long talk or a short talk, if you're well-paced and you're not talking super fast, which is also a problem, when you're well-paced, you show control and people will listen more when you show control. It also helps you to have more vocal variety. And when we have vocal variety, it's a lot more interesting to listen to someone. So those are my tips on communicating with clarity. Let's review. First, audiences need structure. Second, have an introduction. Use the PPU method to keep yourself focused as well as your audience. Third, the power of the pause. Leverage it. Thank you again for listening. Remember, if you want to go to my website, KarenLaus.com, you can get that freebie called 9 Words to Avoid and What to Say Instead. And as always, if you need a speaker for your next event, please keep me in mind. I'd love to have a chat. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
And that's a wrap of another episode of Ignite Your Confidence. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Thank you so much for listening. If you loved today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. It helps other people find the podcast faster, and it certainly helps me. If you're interested in more tips and tools around confidence, please join me over in my Facebook group called Ignite Your Confidence with Karen Laus. Remember, you too can stand out with unshakable confidence.